Our second defense today is by Mr. Garrick Ronkartz, and his thesis statement is, modern epic film has abandoned the classical epic conventions by prioritizing style over substance, therefore creating less memorable stories. Please welcome Garrick.
A good film can be compared to a well-built car. Picture any vehicle you want. However, I will be using a 1995 Mazda Miata. This car has a fresh, shiny coat of black paint, new tires to match, a picture-perfect interior, and even a flying Miata sticker across the windshield for style points. When you go to check under the hood, you notice something is missing. The engine. As you slide into the car, you find an axle seconds away from snapping, and an oil line sliced in two. Not a very functional car, is it? Pretty, yes, but used beyond that. Movies are functionally similar to this analogy. Special effects, cinematography, and acting can all be likened to the visual exterior of the car, and that it is pleasing to look at. And the rest of the film, plot, characters, setting, and the like, are akin to the engine, axle, and oil lines, in that they are what makes a car or film function to its purpose. To take a person somewhere, in reference to a car, or to bring life to a story to inspire or enrich the audience, in reference to film. Modern epic film has abandoned the classic epic conventions by prioritizing style over substance, therefore ruining storytelling. Now for some definitions pertaining to the topic. Film, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is a movie or motion picture. Films can employ techniques using camera work, post-production effects that are 100% impossible to do in reality. Cinematography, or the art or science of motion picture photography, is how shot placement is structured, what allows for perspective to change, and all other aspects of a film that the common viewer will take for granted. CGI, or computer-generated images, is something that everyone is guaranteed to have seen at least once. If everyone here has seen anything remotely Star Wars related, or Marvel for that matter, you have seen CGI used in a film. Moving on, the main focus here is action movies, which are the spiritual descendants of the classic epic stories. Epic stories are defined as long narrative poems recounting heroic deeds, and an action film follows a style. The audience follows some great, normally human being who is exceptionally heroic and or skilled on a journey facing monsters, gods, aliens, other people, or all of the above. Finally, the epic conventions will be the basis for each section of this speech. Being as such, the epic conventions are typically defined as the centrality of a hero, sometimes semi-divine, an extensive, perhaps cosmic setting, heroic battle, extended journey, and the involvement of supernatural beings. Although the divine aspect has been removed for the purposes of some modern tales, they still make the qualities of an epic. I seek to prove that modern epic films, action movies, have begun to abandon the very qualities that make epics so memorable that they survive for thousands of years. To understand what modern action films are doing wrong, it is necessary to understand the precedent set by their predecessors. For understanding this, the epic used will be one of the most famous, the Iliad of Homer. To do this, one has to understand character development, conflict, and resolution. The main character, Achilles, is a one-man army, and he is given a prophecy saying that he will die if he fights, but will live on as a legend, or he will live if he runs from this fight, yet die irrelevant. He chooses to fight, and he does indeed die, becoming both a hero in myth and still a recognizable hero today. These epics had established one very important thing: extremely memorable heroes. For one reason or another, the hero's journey is what stuck with audience, so much so that Achilles is still a fairly recognizable name in Western culture. The most important epic convention is character. Without character, there is no story. We perceive the world of the narrative through the lead. A weak lead leads to weak immersion in the story. Achilles is the main character because his actions dictate the story. His experience is what decides the Trojan War. Now, the descendants of the epic action movies really began to hit their stride in the 1950s. So, I will begin by examining one of the best action films from that era, Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur recounts the story of a man who changes from believing that the Christ would be a conqueror, and he comes to terms with the knowledge that expectation is not always reality. This is a very down-to-earth story. Anyone here can relate to expecting something to be one way, and then being disappointed when that expectation is not reality. This is the relation that lets stories like these stick. The things around the story are merely enhancements. Notice the sets. Real sets. This will be important later. Back in the 70s, a little film called Star Wars pioneered CGI in films. This led to action movies using CGI at a much higher rate. Thusly, the beginning of the downfall of the modern epic began with Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest. Although the story itself is a story of self-sacrifice. Jack Sparrow's arc takes him on a journey to accept his demise, and he is able to provide a future for his allies. Notice, even without the effects present, the majority of the film has something real for the actors to interact with, and that aided heavily in their performances. Dead Man's Chest is a solid movie, and it adheres to the epic conventions wonderfully. However, that is not what caught the audience's eyes. Anyone who has seen the film can attest that the villain of the piece, Davy Jones, looks incredible, even by modern standards. And the animators who brought it to life deserve the praise. Unfortunately, Disney and other major studios saw this as a window of opportunity. Audiences gush over the effects, so maybe they could be distracted by them. Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest marked the beginning of the end for high-budget, well-written epics. Now, it was all too clear that the studio could distract the audience with stunning visuals in exchange for a lackluster story. Epics, despite all being wildly different, share some binding qualities, and those are the epic conventions. But why are they remembered? Books cannot provide stunning visuals to distract an audience, so a book had to maintain the audience's attention via being interesting. But how is that? It is the relatability of the main characters. Think back to the three characters discussed: Achilles, her, and Sparrow. All three men had a flaw that made them relatable. Her had grand expectations that prevented him from seeing the value in the mundane, and Achilles and Sparrow feared their deaths and struggled with accepting their own fast approaching demise. We relate to seeing these heroes overcome problems that plague us while dealing with extraordinary events, not the extraordinary events themselves. Once this relatability was abandoned, and the character struggles unrelatable or non-existent, these stories began to lose their value and memorability. Personally, reading the Iliad and seeing Achilles make a choice to fight for his fallen allies rather than run and hide is inspiring. It is truly what sticks with me when I encounter stories similar to this. I admire the bravery of the characters willing to fight for others even if their death is a guarantee. That is bolstered by knowing what the character values and seeing him or her get from fearful of death to completely selfless. Abandoning the admiration for the characters is abandoning a reason to care. Watching flat characters doing things without discernible motive means nothing, and it is made clear no better than in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is a terrible epic. I just mentioned how epics survive due to character development, and the character arc of this movie could be summarized as Doctor Strange helps a girl discover that her true power was inside of her all along while someone is trying to murder them. Forget the visuals, forget the CGI. Does this stick with you? If you're reading a book with this arc, would you care? Or better yet, watching a film composed of this. Would you care? This plot is unrelatable. Most people have to work to achieve a skill that they did not possess before. Strange does not change the girl he mentors, and the girl he mentors was apparently always awesome. Stories with unrelatable characters never stick. Sure, this film looks pretty, mostly, and the cameos are fun, for the most part, but remember, the effects will age, the shots will age, but the story will last forever. The luster of the effects means nothing if the story means nothing. A good story is a good story regardless of the effects that back it up. That is why prioritizing style over substance is a failed endeavor in film. But why should you care? Art is dying. Major motion pictures are being made in assembly line fashion with no unique elements and as little effort as possible. Instead, opting to create backgrounds and even costumes later. Ian McKellen famously had a breakdown while working on The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, so much so that he shouted, "This is not why I became an actor." McKellen reflected on the moment saying, "I cried. I actually cried." Unfortunately, the microphone was on and the whole studio heard. This is what made Ian McKellen, an 81-year-old man, break down into tears after acting for longer than most people in this room have been alive. This is what is destroying modern film. So, what can be done to combat this? Stop watching garbage. Watching these terrible stories and allowing them to accumulate revenue only incentivizes studios to push out more products of this caliber. Arguing that it does not directly affect me is participating in greed and the desecration of culture. These stories will raise the younger generations. These stories will teach the younger generations morals. And that will be the fault of us for supporting them. Instead, find good stories, support them, and show the executives that stories like those are the ones worth telling. Humanity in every age, and even today, looks to the works of art to shed light upon its path and its destiny. John Paul II. Thank you.
Do we have any faculty questions?
Deacon Collin.
Thank you, Garrick. I wonder if film itself is inherently, because it's visual and image focused, is there an inherent movement towards visually spectacular things and away from the story just inherent to film? Or do you think film is a way of handling stories that can last generations, even though it is visually depicted, versus something like Homer or others where they didn't have a screen and images to tell the story itself had to live on its own?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I do believe that a film will tend towards being a visual experience because of that, especially now that we have technology that you can create entire landscapes in post-production just with a computer. But that doesn't justify them telling a lackluster story. Because you can outsource the backgrounds and the effects to another company to make those. That should not be an excuse for the writer's room to have less quality stories. If that.
Sure. Follow-up question. So you mentioned one film that you thought was a great epic. Do you have any particular film that you can point to that wasn't an adaptation of something literary, so it wasn't telling a book in film form or wasn't telling a comic in film form? Is there a film that you enjoy that you think is a great story written for film? Thank you. That's good.
Mr. Hanson?
Garrick, you mentioned Achilles and the epic works of Homer, which are studied at this school. I'm curious if you could maybe explain what role or what value you would put on these great stories in the Western tradition in a way that might explain some of the shortcomings of the writers in the writer's room that you talked about.
So, this is more of a personal viewing than anything, but epics like the Iliad are they are indicative of the culture of the time. Like, from what I remember, the Iliad was written down with Homer, but it existed in vocal form for hundreds of years prior. So it is one of our only windows into the Greek Dark Ages and how they viewed the pseudo mythical Trojan War, whatever the Trojan War was in actual history. The Iliad is how they viewed it as a divinely inspired endeavor. And so ancient epics and even modern films should always be representative of our time in some way, of how people view the events going on around us, and having something having something that doesn't tell a story, that doesn't teach anyone a moral or teach anyone a valuable moral, it would leave historians in the dark about what we valued in this time period.
Thank you.
Mr. Angarino?
Thank you, Garrick. Garrick, I'm wondering if you could comment on the faithfulness of the Gospels to the epic conventions that you talked about.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't do much research into this, but I'll give it a best shot. The Gospels narrate the story of Jesus primarily from his life, from the beginning of his ministry to his death, and that story revolves around. I'm going to go back to the epic conventions because the centrality of a hero is the epic conventions, by my definition, is the centrality of a hero, sometimes semi-divine, which may fit Jesus, I don't know. An extensive, perhaps cosmic setting, heroic battle, an extended journey, and the involvement of supernatural beings. So the Gospels really are would be the only true epic, at least the only completely accurate epic. So it is primarily focused on Jesus Christ. He is divine. He's 100% divine and 100% human. And the setting is ancient Israel, so that fills in the role of an extensive setting, and the battle against sin and death would be considered a heroic battle. And he did exorcisms and encountered the devil, so supernatural beings get checked off as well. So yes, the Gospels could be considered an epic.
Thank you, Garrick.
Ms. Arbre?
Thanks, Garrick, for your presentation. So you talked about how telling stories can often be used as teachers, as a teaching mechanism or mode for teaching. So how would you suggest we as parents and teachers reclaim storytelling in our modern age?
Well, I think the best example for parents, at least, would be to look back at the early 2000s. Those old Saturday morning cartoons from the early 2000s. They tended to handle complex and mature themes in a way that children could understand. One of my favorite episodes from an old TV show was one of the main characters dealing with fear and denying it, and learning that over time you have to accept and overcome your fear. And it was portrayed in kind of like a creepy-ish way, but not like scare the kids way. So it's things like that to promote, like I said at the end, just to promote stories that deal with mature themes for kids in a palatable way, and allow that those make money instead of something that is bright colors and noise.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Marino?
I'm going to butcher this quote, but Flannery O'Connor said something to the effect of, to the deaf and blind, you have to use bright colors, loud colors, something to that effect. The idea was that sometimes you have to shock your readers, in your case, or your audience in order to really communicate to them, for them to really hear the message. Do you think that some of the modern technology that we have, CGI and whatnot, could be used to effectively shock audiences towards a right message?
Definitely. This show. The show used its quite high budget. I don't have exact sources, but the budget range per episode was 15 to 25 million per episode. That's a lot of money. And it used that high budget to tell a story that spoke of the moral grays of war, and it left the audience to question why people do this, and it didn't answer questions. It didn't condone actions. It didn't condemn actions, but it left the audience to question, what would you do in this scenario, and it did that through a Star Wars setting, and that is probably the best way to use visual effects to put something in a fictional context, to make the audience think, how would I apply this to my own life?
Thank you.
Do we have any senior questions?
Pat?
Thanks, Gary. Okay, so you talk a lot about, you talk about movies have lost a lot of their substance, going for style over substance. Do you think this is occurring in other art forms? Is this like a cultural phenomenon that we're just kind of going for the pretty instead of the meaningful? Like, can you comment on that?
I do think it's a cultural phenomenon, although it's strange in other forms of art. Like, you remember the weird statues that got put up, like the Martin Luther King embrace statue? It's stuff like that. Those are less pretty, more strange, but it is something that is permeating throughout all of art. I just focus on movies because those are, it's a fact of life that movies are gonna touch a lot more people than modern art and books. So that's why I focus on that. But yes, it is permeating all art. Well.
So Garrick, I like what you just said about how movies have a particular capacity to help form us, since it's something that's very available to us, and there's most of the art form that we encounter that tells a story is through the media of movies now, at least in the mainstream sense. So I was wondering, as we go on with our lives and we're watching movies, what type of questions should we be asking to ourselves as we're watching the movie, perhaps, or even before we watch the movie, in order to ensure that we're not consuming garbage, but instead we're consuming a story that's going to help us be like Jesus in the great epic of the Gospels. So maybe some powerful questions to ask ourselves.
Well, the way I do this is a little over the top, so I don't suggest taking every advice just because I'm really critical. But what I do is I'll watch something like once, and just to get like an idea of what the writer wants me to think is happening, if I'm going to be generous, and then go through it like a second time and actually think about the sequence of events. Does the opening lead to the center, and does the center lead to the end, and does everything in between flow? Do what the characters say and do actually move the plot forward, or does the plot itself move itself forward through what people call plot contrivance, which is just things happen to make the plot happen, even if it doesn't make sense. And it takes a while to actually learn how to pick up on things like that, which is fine, but I think everyone should have at least some understanding of that skill once you get to be probably a sophomore age. No offense to the younger kids, but you know, I have to draw a line somewhere. But you have to have that you have to begin to have that understanding, because at that point you are old enough to start supporting these on your own, and they will be heavily influencing you as you enter adulthood.
Thank you, Garrick.